The question that I get all the time these days is the question of how do you know that God exists? And a lot of young people are asking me this question. A lot of Muslim youth have this question in their minds. And, it's a legitimate question. How do we know that God exists? And when I'm asked this, I try to focus on two things. I think there are two basic assumptions that really underlie the confusion that people have on this question. And the two assumptions are, one, people have this kind of scientific view of knowledge where they think that if you don't have scientific proof of God, then there's no reason to believe that God exists. You have to have some kind of scientific evidence. You have to have some scientific proof. And this is something that's really emphasized by new atheists, like Richard Dawkins, for example, or Sam Harris or whoever else. They really emphasize this scientific view of knowledge. The only way that you can know something for certain is if you have scientific evidence and scientific proof that you can, publish in a paper or whatever else. So that's one assumption that a lot of people have, and it's because of this influence from new atheists. And the other assumption is that, if you really want to know that God exists, you have to have some kind of logical proof. There has to be some kind of deductive proof that you present that proves, without a shadow of a doubt in a logical fashion that God exists. So these are the two assumptions that people have about knowledge, about how you can know things in the world. And so if theology, if the existence of God doesn't meet that high standard or that standard at all, then that must mean that there's no reason to believe that God exists, and for all intents and purposes, he doesn't. And so this is the confusion that a lot of Muslim youth have, a lot of non-Muslims have as well. It leads a lot of people to leave religion, unfortunately, and to leave Islam. Unfortunately, there are many examples that I've come across of Muslims who were born Muslim. They're very practicing Muslims in terms of praying and fasting, but they hear these kinds of arguments and it just gets stuck in their brain, it gets stuck in their mind, and they can't, get rid of that doubt. And so it causes a fitna for them. It causes them to leave Islam. It causes them to just disbelieve in God altogether. And so that's a tragedy, and we have to have some way of addressing that. And the very easy way to address this kind of idea or these kinds of misconceptions about the question of how do we know that God exists is to just attack those assumptions about what knowledge means. If you have this idea that the only things that you know and are certain of are those things that are scientific or are proven logically through some kind of deductive proof, that's a very specific view of knowledge. And it's inaccurate. It's a complete misconception. There are so many things that we know in our everyday lives, in our everyday experience, that have nothing to do with science, have nothing to do with deductive proof, and yet we know them. We know them very certainly. And I can give you examples of that in a second. But the idea, it's important to keep this in your mind that, look, if it's true that there are certain things, many things that we know without scientific or logical proof, then why is it a problem if we don't necessarily know God by those very specific means, and by that very narrow conception of how we can know something that you've specified? So that's a general gist of the argument that I try to make. And so what are some other things that we know, we all know, and we all experience very personally, very deeply, but again, they have nothing to do with science or logical proof? I'll give you a few examples. One, consciousness. Our minds, our hearts, our emotions, everything that we experience in our, every waking moment. Our dreams, for example, those are also parts of the mind. Even when we're sleeping, we're experiencing things. So experiences, the mind, consciousness, those are not things that can be proven in terms of science. They're not things that can be dissected in a lab. They're not things that can be put under a microscope. They're completely outside the realm of scientific analysis. And this is something that philosophers and even scientists accept. And you might say, well, you can look at the brain, you can look at electrical signals in the human brain, and you can do all this kind of neurological imaging. But that's a misconception, because the brain is an organ. And the organ of the brain, the material of the brain, is not the same thing as our minds. They're completely categorically different things. The human mind is something that it cannot be reduced to just electrical signals in the brain. And this is something that philosophers, again, have recognized, and they have a name for it. They call it the hard problem of consciousness, this idea that you can't reduce things that happen in your mind, like the thoughts that you have, the content of your thoughts and your experiences. Those phenomenological aspects of who you are cannot be put in terms of a formula or, something that you see in a CAT scan. And that's just, a brute fact about the limits of science, and something that everyone recognizes.